Our final storyteller is James Garcia, and James has a story about how his experiences along the border have helped inform his artistry as a playwright and founder of the new Carpa Theater here in Phoenix. James?
Thank you so much. Thank you. The first thing I want to say before we begin is that I haven't seen this many Latinos on a stage since the last play I wrote. I love it. I love hearing stories. And the stories were fantastic and touching and powerful. And so I'm really honored to just be here and tell this story and to have followed all of these folks. Just really, really beautiful stuff. I first visited the border when I was about 6 or 7 years old. It was in the days when the Rolling Stones weren't getting enough satisfaction. And every girl in my neighborhood was sure that the Beatles loved them. Yeah. My father was actually born in a small town south of the border, a little town called Anahuac, a farm community. And eventually moved, early in his life, moved to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. It's a twin city, Laredo and Nuevo Laredo. And he grew up in what I can only describe as a 3-room shotgun cinder block house that over the years had been painted various shades of fuchsia pink, fuchsia blue, fuchsia green. Fuchsia is a big color on the border. His name was Humberto Maria Guadalupe Garcia. And he was one of 18 children who grew up in that house. He would have been 20, but 2 of the children died at birth or shortly thereafter. And they were born to his mother, of course, Maria Guadalupe Garcia de Los Angeles, who had, as I understand, all of those children before she was 40. So she was an astounding woman. She lived well into her 80s, which always sort of amazed me. The earliest memory I have of the border is being in a black inner tube, floating in the Rio Grande with my brothers, several brothers of mine, and sister. And we were floating basically in the murky waters of the Rio Grande, not because we were trying to get into the country illegally. I was born in Chicago, as most of my siblings were, but because it was hot. We used to call it Laredo hot, and this is what you did. You floated along the Rio Grande just to cool off. And I recall at the time that when you would do this, you would be near the international bridges and you'd look up and you would see Border Patrol agents, and they really didn't pay much attention to you. And frankly, you didn't pay much attention to them. And at this time, there weren't any walls or fences or drones or radar. It was a pretty lackadaisical kind of atmosphere. In those days, if you wanted some cheap tortillas and you were in Laredo, you just crossed. You just went to Nuevo Laredo. If you were in Nuevo Laredo and you needed a used car that ran well, you crossed north and you bought a used car. Around this time, we lived for a time just south of Laredo in Nuevo Laredo in a ranchito, a little 1-room shack painted fuchsia blue, of course, that had no floor. Had no running water, no indoor plumbing. And we got our water delivered to us, I think about once a week in a 55-gallon drum in a truck that I used to call the elephant truck because it reminded me of the hose, the large hose that would sort of flop out and fill the 55-gallon drum every day. Reminded me of an elephant at that age. And one of the rituals living in that little house was that we would take a cup or 2 of the water after it arrived, and we would sprinkle it on the floor and sweep it as hard as we could to make it, solid, right? So that you wouldn't have dust blowing all around. I lived with about 4 of my brothers at the time. At the time we attended school in the United States, of course. Though we crossed, the way we did this was my mother would drive us. I think she had a '64 Cadillac at the time, and she would drive us from the Ranchito to the end of the highway on the south side of Nuevo Laredo. We would catch a city bus. We would ride that bus 20 minutes to the international border. We would get out, we'd walk across, and I don't honestly remember ever being asked for papers or identification. Basically, customs would say, American citizen, and we'd say yes, and they'd say, have a nice day. And we would we'd cross the border there, and then we would catch another city bus, and we would ride about 20 or 25 minutes to a school near the Laredo Air Force Base. And that's where I attended school. And that was basically my life as a boy on the border. Now fast forward 20 years, and I'm working at the Laredo Morning Times. And this is in the era when Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, and the proxy Cold Wars in Central America were in full bloom, and by then at least tens of thousands of people had died in those wars, and tens of thousands more would die in the years to come. And the border by then, as a young police reporter, which was my job at the time, by then had become a place where large quantities of drugs had started to move north, particularly cocaine, Peruvian, Colombian cocaine. This is in the days of Pablo Escobar. And what was moving south at the time were guns. A lot of small and large weaponry headed for the Central American wars, and sold really by the thousands at the time. People smuggling then was really small potatoes. If you needed a smuggler at about that time to bring you across the border, you might pay them what really amounted to more like a handling fee than any significant amount of money. And this, of course, was long before the days where you would find people spending up to $2,000, $3,000 or a trip to come across now, as they do now. This was also a time when you could actually flip your television set on and watch as two candidates for the GOP debated in the race for the presidency, and each one of them was trying to top each other and convince America that they would be providing amnesty before the other. This was a famous debate that Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush had at the time, George H. Walker Bush at the time. And they could do this and get away with it and actually be regarded as common sense leaders. So it was a very, very, very different time. At the time, people from Mexico were stereotyped and maligned and so forth, but they weren't really considered the menace that they are cast as today. It was a very different period. And I recall thinking back about that time, that then, as now, Mexico actually was sending its best. They sent my father in the 1950s. He came to the United States. He worked 35 years for U.S. Steel. He took his pension, and he went back to Mexico to live in that 3-room cinder block house. And then he died at a very young age, I think, in his early 60s, from really heart congestion and kind of congestion that comes from having worked in a foundry, in a steel foundry on the south side of Chicago for 35 years. And if you've ever been to a foundry, it's basically a place where you can kind of pick up black coal disease. And I think a lot about the work that he did and how really his pattern of life and his journey here was like so many other literally millions of people from that part of the world who have come to our country. Now, I don't know exactly what it was about this time, but I remember that it was about this time that, for me, the border began to lose its innocence. I don't know if it was the FBI raids that, as I covered as a reporter, where they would try to seize caches of weapons that were headed to the Central American wars, or if it was the searing image of a young man bound north, running through the brush in South Texas with his 4-year-old daughter clutched under his arm, destined for whatever fate would bring to him here in the United States. And it was about this time that I started writing plays. And now, 30 years almost passed, and 30-plus plays having been written, my plays, again and again, have come back to essentially tell the stories, not just of this region, it's natural, right? This is a region that I've lived in, but again and again I've visited the stories of immigrants, many of whom are just passing through, and whether folks sometimes here in Arizona believe it or not, most immigrants, of course, are just passing through. They're not coming to Arizona to stay. And in those years, I've written stories, plays, often about dreamers, who of course we hear a lot about today. It happens that they have kind of come up again and again in my stories. I wrote a story called Tears of Lives about a family that was, in which the father was deported and he left behind children and they had to survive for themselves, and a story called Dream Act about a young woman who studied at a university in California and would get up every morning and go to school, and then she would come to the library and sleep overnight at the library, and then at about 5 in the morning she would get up again and go to the Student Services Center, take a shower, and do it all over again until she graduated with a degree in chemistry. And I wrote about a dreamer who I call the first dreamer, Raul H. Castro, the only ever Hispanic governor of the state of Arizona. The name of the play was actually American Dreamer, because it occurred to me after playing with a couple of other titles that in many ways this was the first dreamer, because he had crossed in 1916 when he was 2 years old with 11 brothers and sisters and his parents. And he told the story when he was alive, he just passed recently, but he would tell the story that when they crossed, the immigration inspector supposedly said to his father, "Castro family, you're in the United States of America now. The rest is up to you." He went on as an undocumented immigrant to become naturalized, to become a lawyer, to become a judge, to become a prosecuting attorney, to become a 3-time U.S. ambassador, and then the governor of the state of Arizona. A dreamer, not unlike so many of the dreamers that we have today. And finally, I'll mention that a piece that I did called A Mexica, which kind of touches somewhat thematically on what you've heard tonight about the reporting project that's going on now with the Arizona Republic and the Gannett Papers. And it's the story of a young poet who grows up away from the border and learns as a young adult that he was actually born on the border, born in a small town, fictional town that I call Agua Prieta, dark water. Right? In my Agua Prieta, a reservoir had been built 50 or 60 years ago that had smothered the town. And his family was from there. This is what he learned when he became a young man. He learned that his family's roots were there, and he wanted to go there. He wanted to learn about this place that his family had come from because he had never seen it. He didn't know anything about the border. And so he travels the border and he traverses it, and he goes back and forth across the border, and he meets all sorts of interesting people along the way. And then he finally gets to Agua Prieta. And when he arrives, fortunately for him, there's been a drought that's been going on for several years. And the water has receded enough so that he can rent a rowboat and he can paddle through the town. And so at one point or another, he has to avoid carefully not knocking over tombstones that are peeking out from the water. And eventually he goes into the cathedral. He goes through the archway of the cathedral. And then he finds himself suddenly 200 years in the past. And he meets a woman who is his great-great-grandmother. And they sit and they have a conversation on the moss-covered, rotting wooden pews of this ancient church. And they talk for hours about whether it's better to live in her time or in his time. Which is the better option? What world is better? And eventually they conclude that it isn't when you live, but it's how you live and how well you live. And whether you have an opportunity, whether born on the Mexican side of the border as she was, or on the American side of the border as he was, to live in a world where you're treated with dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, for rounding out our evening and for doing so much for the arts in our community here. We were really pleased to have James share his story this evening because you heard a lot of basic facts tonight. And we felt like so many of us, though, experience our culture through arts, whether that's plays or music or literature. And we wanted to hear from somebody whose job it is to kind of take some of the facts and the media that the media creates and maybe make it more accessible in different ways for the rest of us to get a little closer. Because as much as I wish the newspaper were enough for everyone, I hear you guys read and like other things.